We're talking about a definition of the rapture that is understood within the pre-wrath model that's going to focus tonight on how are we to understand Matthew's words. Remember, we've got two diametrically opposing perspectives on Matthew's words that we just read a moment ago, which bears an impact and importance with Paul's words that we just read in Thessalonians. And you'll see this in a moment, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So here's Brother Eggman's definition of the rapture. This thing that many Christians like to throw under the bus and abandon. And I've stood on my soapbox in previous teachings and told you why I think it's a bad idea to try to abandon the idea of rapture. It's a bad idea. And in case you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and listen to I think probably episode number 265 or 6 or 7. It's within the last 5 episodes. Well, here's what Brother Eggman has to say. The rapture occurs when Jesus comes with the clouds of heaven and with a trumpet blast sends his angels to gather Christians from the earth to meet him in the clouds. The dead in Christ rise first, and then those who are left alive will also meet him. In a twinkling of an eye, we are all changed. I inserted the word all, but that's really what's happening. We are all changed and receive a new body. During this event, every eye on earth will see Jesus and mourn. And then notice the verses that are connected to the pre-wrath understanding of rapture, which I might add, like for instance, we go back to this chart, is consistent with either this or this. Either one of them works, maybe even this. But these particular charts that are flashing in front of you, the verses that I'm about to rattle off from Brother Eggman's perspective are consistent with either a pre-wrath model, but they're also consistent with a post-trib model. So the post-trib and the pre-wrath, the last two on this chart, and the two on the bottom, the post-trib and the pre-wrath on this chart, are consistent with the verses that I'm reading here. Matthew 24, 26, and 31, as well as 24, 36 through 43. Right? That verse alone is not interpreted by the pre-tribbers as rapture. I'm not 100% sure if the mid-tribbers do. I have to go back and research. Their positions vary. It's probably one of the positions that I know the least about. Even though I study it, I don't get all of the information I need to give me a clear perspective. I have to keep reading and rereading because of its unusual nature. But I am very, very familiar with the pre-trib model, and they definitely say that Matthew 24, Yeshua's all the discourse, is a description not of rapture, but a description of second coming. And again, part of the reason is because, from their perspective, rapture is signless, and Jesus definitely describes signs and sequences, right? 6 seal sign. In other words, Jesus says in Matthew 24, 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days. So in their understanding, post-trib, they believe that the word tribulation there is a reference to the 7-year tribulation. So when Jesus says immediately after the tribulation of those days, he's talking about the 7-year tribulation. Well, the post-tribbers think that Jesus is also talking about the tribulation that's 7 years long, but they think that he's talking about the rapture, not the second coming. So Matthew 24 for pre-trib is not the rapture, but Matthew 24 for post-trib is the rapture. And it most definitely is the rapture for pre-wrathers. 1 Corinthians 15:51, the verse that talks about we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. That's Paul's description of the rapture. I think by all 4 views agree that this is a rapture passage. 1 Thessalonians 4:15 through 17, as well as 2 Thessalonians 2:1 through 12. And it doesn't mention, Brother Eggman doesn't mention 1 Thessalonians 5 in this little chart here, but the Thessalonian letters, by and large, are viewed by, I think, everyone as rapture passages, but when we get to the pre-trib, they have a hard time with 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. I think they describe that one as second coming. So I'm pretty sure that's what they do. So for them, Paul switches from defining from talking about what he calls the coming of the Lord, referring to rapture, to suddenly describing the coming of the Lord as describing the second coming, which is really a bit of confusion, in my opinion. In fact, it's not a bit, it's a lot. According to Rapture in the pre-wrath view, Revelation 1:7 it talks about Rapture. Revelation 6:12 through 7:17 talks about Rapture. Revelation 14:14 to 16 talks about Rapture. So that's Brother Eggman's perspective. Eventually, we'll probably look at all of those verses, so don't worry if you're not sure what those verses are talking about. Let's keep reading. Let me check my time real quick. All right, we're doing good on time. Let's keep going with Brother Eggman. We're talking about a pre-wrath model of the rapture, and we're utilizing the notes from Brother AARON Eggman. His book is entitled The Saints Go Up and the Wrath Comes Down. And what he's making a case for right now, that's why we're using his notes, making a case for the pre-wrath rapture involves understanding that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Paul, and the book of Revelation eventually, are all discussing the same event. So let's let Brother Eggman articulate it this way. Matthew 24:30 through 44, and 1 Thessalonians 4:16 through 5:5 are teaching the exact same events. Now, this is important because the pre-tribbers say that Matthew 24 is talking about the second coming, but 1 Thessalonians 4 is talking about the rapture. So according to pre-tribbers, Jesus and Paul are not in agreement with one another. They're talking about two different events. And yet, what we're going to find here in a moment, as we get through the charts and Brother Eggman's descriptions of his charts, we're going to find that it's actually better to interpret Jesus and Paul as talking about the same thing, not separating them. So let's keep reading. The table below reveals striking similarities between Paul's teaching and what Jesus himself taught about his coming. So as we're progressing through these notes, if you're a post-tribber, then you're going to find a lot of agreement with what we're about to read, because your version of rapture includes going through the tribulation. And whether you're a pre-trib, post-trib, pre-wrather, where you believe that we're not going to go through the day of the Lord, or you're a classic post-tribber where you believe we are going to go through the day of the Lord, either way, you're still going to allow for Matthew 24 to describe, in other words, you're still going to allow for Jesus to be describing the rapture. The only difference you're going to have with we pre-wrathers, we classic pre-wrathers, is that when on the 70th week of Daniel, when the rapture happens. But the sequence of tribulation and then rapture and then wrath, or tribulation / wrath and then rapture, either one of those, you're still going to have some agreement with, as a post-tribber, that they're all going to be at the very end of the week. All right, let's read Brother Eggman. Again, let me say this real quick, because some of you are probably confused. I'm not very happy that there's a healthy amount of ambiguity and equivocation going on with the terms tribulation and wrath. It's very unfortunate that among the four positions, that's really what it amounts to, is heavy disagreement over what the terms tribulation and wrath define and what the coming of the Lord defines. And so all we can do is continue to pray that the Lord will continue to reveal more and more details to us and give us clarity, because of our differences between these terms, tribulation, wrath, and coming of the Lord. We end up with opposing positions on what's going on, and yet we're all reading the same resources. Go figure. And yet not all of us are correct. Say, here's what Brother Eggman has to say. Paul based his teaching on Jesus' teachings, and I hold to that as well. He was not describing a separate event. When Paul is describing an event, the coming of the Lord, in 1 Thessalonians, he's describing the same event that Jesus described as the coming of the Lord in Matthew. Paul was purposely directing readers to make a connection between his teachings and Jesus' words on his coming. So here's the chart that, let me look at my time. Here's the chart that I'll probably stop with for tonight, because this will take a little bit of time to explain. This is a chart put together by Brother AARON Eggman. It is available on his website, and you're going to find it in the book if you have it. The saints go up and the wrath comes down. That's the book. Comparing Jesus and Paul's teachings on Jesus' second coming. And the label here that Brother Eggman gave it at the very top where it says Jesus' second coming is a bit purposeful to the degree that when you read through the Bible, and we're talking about both Testaments, Old and New, Tanakh, as well as Apostolic Scriptures, Old and New Testaments, essentially what you're meant to walk away with is the understanding that there are two comings of the Lord. There's his first coming 2,000 years ago in Bethlehem, in a manger, and then he came as a baby, and then he grew up, and then he performed his ministry, then he died on a cross, he was resurrected, he ascended on high. That's the first coming of Jesus. That's told about, that's spoken about in the Bible in no ambiguous terminology, but we should call that the first coming. Even though there were a lot of events associated with it, we're still talking about one primary event known. We could say there were a lot of not events. I'm always forgetting the word that I want to use, but I believe it starts with an E as well. There are a lot of details associated with one event, but we're still talking about one event known as first coming. By comparison, and in addition, but not contrast per se, we have the second coming of Christ. This is the event described in both places of the Bible, Old and New Testaments, right? So Jews have no excuse. That's why I keep emphasizing this. There is also a second coming of Christ. When we look at the second coming of Christ, we have to factor in all of these details connected with the second coming. Rapture, resurrection, judgment being poured out, the salvation of Israel, the judgment of Antichrist, the Battle of Armageddon, the riding on white horses. All of these events, and I left out some other major ones, such as the wedding supper of the Lamb, the Bema Seat judgment, the Bema Seat reward, things like that. All of these events are connected to the second coming. So it's necessary, and I'm really stressing this. That's why I'm slowing down a little bit. It is absolutely necessary and crucial to understand from a biblical perspective that there's only one, count it, one second coming. Now, the reason I'm stressing that is because when we go back over to some of these models, let's go back up to this view of pre-trib. In the pre-trib model, we have a rapture on the far left of our screen, which is before the 7 years kicks off. And then we have the second coming on the right side of the screen, which is after the 7 years has run its course. In this model, we're left with one of two ways of explaining the big gap between the rapture and the second coming. One of those explanations is to say that the rapture and the second coming are two comings of Christ. He comes once to rapture us, and then he comes again to usher in his kingdom. Really, then, that means there's not two comings of Christ. There's not, like I said earlier, where he came once 2,000 years ago and he's coming again to deal with the church. Instead of being two overall biblical comings of Christ, from the broadest sense of the view, one way of describing what we're looking at now is that there's actually three. We have the first time that he came 2,000 years ago, and then we have the second time where he's coming in front of the 7 years. And then we have a third time when he's going to come after the 7 years. That's 1, 2, 3. That's one way of describing what we're looking at in this chart, right? You would have to agree. Given the fact that the second and the third comings of Christ are separated by a healthy 7 years, and they don't seem to be connected with one another in any way. The first one on the left is in connection with the church being snatched up into heaven, but Israel being left on earth. And the one on the far right is in connection with the church returning to earth, but Israel being raptured. In essence, there's two raptures according to the pre-trib version. Two gatherings, if you want to call it that. If you don't like me saying two raptures as a pre-tribber, if you don't like me saying it, describing it that way, two raptures, at least you would have to agree that there's two gatherings. One gathering is the rapture of the church, and the second gathering in Matthew 24:31 is the gathering of Israel, meaning the rapture of Israel. Okay, that's one way of describing what we're seeing on this chart. Another way of describing it, however, is where the pre-tribbers will say, no, we're not saying there's a second and a third coming, first and a second and a third. No, we're not saying that. We are saying that there's two comings, but we're just saying that the rapture is this separate event that's a standalone event. It's not involved with the second coming. So they either divorce it from the second coming in that explanation, or they simply describe the rapture as a second coming and the second coming as a third coming, meaning the verbiage on this chart is a bit misleading in that regards. So either way, you have some confusion, right? You read Jesus talking about him coming back, his coming, his return, right? His Parousia, which we're going to talk about in this during this topic. You have him talking about his Parousia. And as Dr. Brown has so humorously articulated, we have Jesus telling his disciples, look for my coming, but then after that, look for my coming, right? I'm going to come back, and then after that, I'm going to come back, meaning there are two of them. And if I can find the exact quote in time, it's during a debate with a pre-tribber that he had, and I can't remember exactly the terminology, but if I can find it, I'll make a quote on the screen so you can see it, where he says, according to the pre-trib view, where we equivocate on the terms tribulation and coming, then we have Jesus telling us that the coming, no man knows the day or the hour of the coming, but according to Daniel, you can know the day and the hour of the coming. And he told his disciples, don't worry, you don't know when I'm going to come, but according to the signs, you'll know when I come. And I'm not talking about the coming in Matthew, but I am talking about the coming in Thessalonians and things like that. So it gets really, really convoluted. So let me finish up with this chart, and this will do it for tonight. Brother Eggman's chart has the comparing of Jesus and Paul's teaching on Jesus' second coming. Notice not on Jesus' rapture, it's on Jesus' second coming, because in the pre-wrath model, even though there's only one second coming, there are two events associated with one second coming, and the rapture is one of those events, and the coming back to earth to do battle at Armageddon is one of the other events of the second coming, the second coming, the Parousia. So let me just read these for you, and then we'll close out tonight. Looking at the blue part on the left, reading left. Well, it's all blue part. Sorry about that. Looking at the dark blue part on the left, we have a label that says about Jesus coming back. And we've got, reading from left to right, as far as the references, Matthew 24:30. And this corroborates with 1 Thessalonians 4:16. And then, going left on that side again, Jesus located in the clouds, Matthew 24:30. And then 1 Thessalonians 4:17, cloud language. Third one, a trumpet sounds before the rapture. Matthew 24:31 correlates with 1 Thessalonians, or parallels to 1 Thessalonians 4:16. Angels involved in the rapture, Matthew 24:31 correlates with or parallels to 1 Thessalonians 4:16. Christians are raptured. Matthew 24:31, 40-41 is parallel with 1 Thessalonians 4:17. People of the world caught unaware at Jesus' coming, Matthew 24:39 is parallel to 1 Thessalonians 5:3. Jesus' coming brings destruction and judgment to the world. Matthew 24:39 is parallel to 1 Thessalonians 5:3. People of the world living life as normal when Jesus comes back. Matthew 24:37-39 is parallel to 1 Thessalonians 5:3. Jesus' coming will be like a thief in the night to the unprepared. Matthew 24:43 as well as 48-50 is parallel to 1 Thessalonians 5:2 and 4. And then lastly, on Aaron's brother Eggman's list is believers are exhorted to keep watching to be ready for Jesus' coming. Matthew 24:42-44 is parallel to 1 Thessalonians 5:4-6. So the point that Brother Aaron Eggman is bringing up, and I'm drawing our study to a close with this, the point he's bringing up is that at the best face value, normative, customary, ordinary reading of the words that we encounter in the Olivet Discourse, which is found in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, and Luke 21, we take those verses and we compare them to what we just read in Paul's letters to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 as well as 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. When we compare those, we're in the best position when we come to the conclusion that we're reading about the same events due to all of the similarities between the events. And this flies in the face of a pre-trib model that tells us that Matthew's account, Mark and Luke as well, so the Olivet Discourse is not a description of the rapture. It's a description of the second coming at the end of the 7th week. However, by comparison, that same view, pre-tribbers, are going to tell us that Paul's letters in 1 and 1 Thessalonians are indeed a description of the rapture. Go figure. Even though we've got all these parallels, they're going to tell you, wow, that's just coincidence. You can hear the sarcasm in my voice. That's just coincidence that they're paralleled. It doesn't mean they're the same event. And I beg to differ. But we're going to stop here. That'll do it for tonight. Let me look at the time. Yeah, we're right at a good time. That's going to do it for our study for tonight. We'll pick this up next week and keep talking about defining the rapture through the lens of a pre-wrather, such as Brother Aaron Eggman and myself. We're trying to make a case for the pre-wrath rapture, and we're going to continue going through the details of how can this rapture present itself in the Bible using the pre-wrath model, but using all of the resources at our disposal and not contradicting any of the information. Let's let the Bible speak for itself in a non-contradictory fashion, okay? That'll do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events.